Yeah, I absolutely agree. As a physical therapist, I deal with two type of athletes. I have the in-season athlete, and when is it right to put them back on the field versus the athlete who is done for the season and having to get back out there. I often have conversations with my athletes, sometimes early in the season, where I'm saying, hey, listen, this is a football season. We've got 10 games plus the playoffs. The athletes are so competitive. They want to be out there, and you discuss the risk factors and you speak with the parents and you say, hey, these are the risks. This is oftentimes the surgeon will be like, it's up to you guys. And I'll give them all the information. I try and tell the kids and say, hey, when you're out there, and even the coach is going to go, is your 80% better than the next best player on the team as far as protecting the quarterback? Because I'll say, hey, if you're in lineman, I'm like, it's not just you have to think about. I know you want to be back on the field, but there's 10 other guys out there that you have to protect. And are you being selfish and going back out there? Are you going to be better than the next guy and be able to protect? Because if you're injured, you're unable to go and you miss your block, you can't do it. That could be your ACL, of your quarterback or something like that. Versus we go through and we watch people's movements and we look for guarding and we try to correct for that and try and put them as best you can in a controlled environment. But there's something to be said. I can't be out on the field in a professional sports team. Yeah, the athletic trainer and the physical therapist can be out on the field in the practice field and observe everything. And we don't get to do that as much. I don't have time, money, access, that kind of thing. Once that athlete returns to the field, there's still going to be, sometimes I feel that there could be a psychological, like, hey, you're fine here, but then you step over that chalk line and then there's another, there's something else that's a barrier that I might not be aware of. I didn't really ask a question there, but any advice in dealing with those two type of situations?
Listen, this is something that's very familiar to you, and this is why first of all, it's great that you know something about kinesiophobia, something about guarding on the psychological, on the mental end, and how it can relate to another, getting re-injured, and nobody wants that. Nobody wants that on a player level, a coach level. The PT doesn't want it. You can be sure the organization doesn't want it. But sometimes this guarding against re-injury can happen. And so I know this is very familiar, and I think that it's good that you have a knowledge base on some of these integrated factors that can sort of help the athlete in lots of different ways. I see this in a lot of coaches where they have their training for the individual athlete, but they often don't have as much even knowledge as, let's say, someone like you understanding these other factors. And so when I'm providing, education and training, it's not just for the individual athlete. I'm working with the PTs and the OTs and the coaches, so they all have a better knowledge base in some of these things that might not be as well known to some of them. And sometimes there are things are changing, but years and years ago, they would really see, like I said, the mental game way over here. And what is this mental game? What does psychology have to do with protecting the quarterback, or what does that have to do with running the 40-yard dash and in 4-4? Well, it is a lot to do with it, and it's just about dialogue and communication. And I find myself that I'm still doing a decent amount of that, which is fine. I mean, you only know what you know, but I learned in turn from them, maybe something on the tactical or the technical or the physical end. I just think as practitioners, we can all learn from each other, see us all as a performance team, and hopefully, more parents and athletes will retain your services and retain my services. so that they have a really good mental game and that they're, physically fit and loose and flexible and all those things.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said. You have new PTs out there, and no disrespect to them, they have all this, they tout evidence-based knowledge, but there's something still to be said about clinical experience in the field of such as you, someone coming out of school, just learning it and applying the practical from the didactic knowledge versus having been either I've been an athlete and been injured in returning to sport, as well as treating athletes and the mental aspect of that. And I think I got lucky when I started my own private practice like 14 years ago. I became certified as a Titleist golf fitness instructor and worked with Dr. Greg Rose with the title TPI. And he was the first one to actually introduce me to this whole concept of this team for specifically golfer. And obviously back then when it was Tiger Woods was at the top of his game, and they talked about all the different people that were involved to make Tiger who he was. There was that physical therapist, the doctor, the massage therapist, nutritionist, the equipment guy, the swing coach, but also the mental coach was huge. So how does one, how do I get my clients involved with you? How does someone, how can I refer you business? How can my people listen to this and say, hey, I want to work with Seth. I recognize I've heard some of these things. I want to either A, improve my performance, or B, someone like my daughter who tore ACL and wants to get back on it. How do we get people involved, working with you and your services?
No, I appreciate that. Generally, if an athlete has sort of struggled with the mental game, oftentimes they have struggled with it for a while, and they're not self-correcting. Where, let's say, they're doubting in their abilities or putting so much pressure on themselves to perform, or anger and frustration is getting the better of them, and they just know that if they're a little bit more sort of had this emotional calm, and if they're more calm and composed, and that's interrelated with internal self-confidence. Let's say if an athlete really does not have a very good mental skill set, emotional skill set, where things, like as I mentioned, it could be self-doubt, or they're overthinking, their body is not where they want it to be, there's muscle tension and tightness. If they struggle with the mental game, they've likely struggled with it for a while, and they're not self-correcting, and they're probably making some connections between their performance and the mental game. That's exactly someone that I would work with. Generally, I work with the athletes that are a little bit more competitive. So if you have a competitive athlete, highly skilled, but they're just not performing at a high level on a consistent basis, and they think that it might have something to do with the psychological and the mental game, that's the type of person who, would be a good candidate for mental training and mental conditioning. And that's sort of the ideal candidate, someone who is really talented in terms of tactical skills, technical skills, physical skills, but they're just underperforming, where that talent, that ability, which might be considerable, is just not transferring over. And it's probably because they have some mental and emotional barriers that are standing in the way. That's sort of the ideal person, the ideal athlete client that I work with. And then what happens is, through our mental and emotional skill development, we get them where they want to be in mind and body. And now they start executing at a much higher, a much higher level. So it does take some awareness, like why am I not performing as well as I should be? And if you think it's maybe a straight technical thing, you'll probably seek out a coach. If you think it's a straight physical thing, you might seek out the strength and conditioning or a physical therapist or someone like that. But if you think that there's sort of the X factor, maybe you can't put your finger on it, but you just sort of know that if you're more confident, trusting, focused, calm, and composed, that you'd perform a heck of a lot better. That's really that's really the athlete that would be a really good candidate to work with someone like someone like me.
So, last thing, I'm looking for some parting advice to my athletes who have just undergone surgery and it's a long road to recovery. What advice do you have to them to help them get through the long journey? I have a kid today, Nick, who's having he dislocated his shoulder twice during the football season, and now he's got 4 months because of COVID. Season starts up in August. He's got a long road, but it's a short, it's not as long as someone who had another kid that had surgery on Friday. He's a senior, but he had ACL. Like, what kind of long advice do you have them say to deal with this long-term road?
Right. It starts with a more difficult transition is if you maintain a pre-injury mindset. It's really important to sort of graduate and make that shift into what your current situation is, and so that a new narrative develops based on this very new situation. This could be post-surgery, being out of action for a while, and then adjusting expectations as well, which means as part of your rehab and recovery, there might be some pain that's associated with that. It's almost inevitable. But then I could work with that athlete and learn some pain coping techniques. Some athletes like to associate with pain. Some athletes like to dissociate with pain. And I talk some of the specifics of that. So it's a more of a new narrative emerges saying, okay, now I'm in this space. I'm no longer in soldiering, so active duty. I'm no longer sort of this healthy, athlete. I'm now in a new situation. We have a recognition of it. And then as you talk it through, what does right sound like to me in this new environment? And what are some things that are within our locus of control that helps us to cope and thrive in this less than desired environment, right? The person doesn't want to get injured. The person didn't want surgery. The person didn't want to be outside of sport. How do we negotiate that? So that's my first, if there's some type of takeaway, it's having the mental flexibility and being sort of personally adaptive and affirm to yourself that things have changed, but that I have the ability to thrive even in this less than ideal environment. Then I might work with that person so that in that time outside of sport, you sort of negotiate it well. You stay mentally healthy. You still stay kind of physically fit to the best that you can do. You stay optimistic, still stay goal oriented. Now, all these things are sometimes difficult when you are out of action, and let's say you have surgery, and it's going to be the time frame to return to sport, depending on the severity and the nature of the injury and the surgery, could be a while. But that's another role for somebody like me to be a part of the performance team, because you're going to have certain markers, right? You're going to have certain goals and range of motion and flexibility and ability to cope with pain and some metrics and quantify progress, right? Helping them to get the most out of this situation, make a successful rehabilitation, recovery from injury. And that's something that is important to me as well. And I think that Andrew, as you work with a lot of people, who are injured, the psychological toll that it can take if they have, find it very difficult to, if they're not coping as well in this very new, environment, and especially if they've never been there before. And oftentimes in baseball, when I was with the Orioles, I was there 2012 to 2018. What's really hard is if you're out of action for a while and you have to see guys who are in your draft class, guys who you came up with through the ranks, seeing them advance precisely because they're on the field. If you're on the field, it gives you at least the opportunity to do well. To see a player who was in your draft class, and now maybe they've gone from low A to high A to double A and triple A, going from the Delmarva Shorebirds to the Frederick Keys to the Bowie Bay Sox to the Norfolk Tides. I'm just talking about the Orioles minor league teams. And now, but you're still an A ball, and the other guy's knocking on the door at triple A, getting close to the boyhood dream because you're injured and you have to watch them you have to watch them advancing their career. You're watching them get through the minor league pipeline and you were drafted with them. This can be really hard to cope with. And what often happens, athletes, there was never an issue with the Orioles of our pitchers coming back too slowly. It was always coming back too quickly. And that's associated with wanting to be back out there on the field, to put up the numbers, to get the contract, to advance their career. So you have to be careful not to, sometimes you have to take just one step back to take two steps forward. And what I generally see is athletes who, especially the high level athletes, sometimes they just come back too quickly and don't have that degree of patience and to see more broadly and more long-term than short-term.
Yeah, I often use the analogy of someone who's gone through a divorce, that after the divorce is over, you kind of miss your ex-wife or ex-husband, and you only remember the good things. You don't remember all the arguments and all the bad things going on. So oftentimes when I'm dealing with a long-term athlete, the advice that I give them is, and same thing with, I think, with people trying to lose weight, I'm like, don't visualize yourself back on the field yet. We've got at least 9 months before you're going to be there. Right now the motivation is remember what it felt like to be on the field and run. Don't worry about what you're going to feel like in the future. Right now, we have to focus on remembering what it felt like to be out there. But at what point, at some point there has to be a transition. Like, all right, at what point in the journey do I say, all right, now we see the light at the end of the tunnel? Mm-hmm. How do you know when that time to bring that up? Because you've talked about don't use time. When I've talked about my daughter with you, said you don't use time frames for the athletes because they get stuck on, hey, if I'm not cleared by this, then they get down. But at what point do we say, hey, we're this close? How do you know when to make that transition? I mean, as an armchair psychologist that I am.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So sometimes we want to get away we don't want to be too number centric. We don't want this to be about time frames, because then that often leads to putting a lot of your pressure to get back in at this certain date, at this certain time. And then you probably get away from all the things that got you to that point and on the cusp of transitioning back into sport. Oftentimes that dividing line is when your medical team around you says, 3 months ago, we weren't here. We were sort of visualizing those small steps and celebrating those gains. Even times some of those gains in rehab and recovery are incremental, celebrating the wins along the way. But oftentimes once we've sort of listened and learned and applied whatever the rehab recovery program is, and then I find that once you get the medical clearance or are about to be cleared, as long as you stay on this path of recovery, then there's often a little bit of a shift. But it's precisely because of that shift that last period of time can be very, very difficult, because essentially what we want to do is the same rehab and recovery that got you the medical clearance and all the steps that you took. That's the same stuff that helps you to get across and coping and thriving. That's the same stuff that carries you across the finish line. So I think that it's important not to become too outcomes based, too results focused, too much about specific dates and times on the calendar. All that sort of takes care of itself in terms of achieving a more preferred timeline without focusing so much on times or some things that you can't control, like an organization saying, okay, you're ready and we're going to bring you up. So it's really important to stay a little bit more short term, really process focused, which means you're just focusing on things that are within your control. But certainly, when you get a little closer to the finish line, if you get medical clearance, there's real reason for optimism. But oftentimes you want to just keep doing what you're doing. It's almost like in golf. What you did for the first 54 holes, in terms of mentally and technically. And now let's say you've got a 3-stroke lead heading into the final round on Sunday. Well, the same stuff that you're doing through 54 holes that got you the 3-stroke lead heading into the final round of the PGA Tour event, that's the same stuff that carries you across the finish line. But oftentimes in golf, you'll see on Sunday, especially on the back nine, things can start to fall apart precisely because you're closer to the finish line.
That's a great analogy.
And
that's
now,
for injuries. That I never even thought about it like that. That's a great analogy.
Yeah. And so now some things can change, but through some mental conditioning allows you to sustain that high level performance. Because remember, let's say we've all seen this if you watch enough golf, where you'll have a really talented player who is, 3-stroke lead heading into the back nine on Sunday with the tournament and the championship on the line. And then you sometimes can see this thing go south, and sometimes very, very quickly. Now, all you see is, let's say, the lack of swing fluidity. All you see is maybe a breakdown in the technical execution. And now you don't have the accurate ball striking, and the outcome of the shot is lousy. That's all seen, and now you see double bogey. So what's seen is the scorecard. What you can see is the lack of swing fluidity. What you can see is the less than ideal ball striking and the less than ideal outcome on that shot. But what you cannot see is the mental game, and they've fallen into this results trap. They're falling into a trap, and they're now focusing on the scorecard. They're focusing on the leaderboard. They're shifting and becoming outcomes based, results focused, number focused, and rewards focused, like the money and the trophy and the lead and all things like that. And when you start focusing on things that you very much want, like results and winning and the rewards that come from that, that leads to you sort of breaking down in mind and body. And now you're doing things like you're telling yourself, like, just don't make a mistake here. Maintain the lead. And we weren't doing any of those things for 54 holes. We weren't doing any of those things that gave us that 3-stroke lead. And so that's what can happen when you get a little closer to the finish line. You can become outcomes based, results focused, and a whole host of things happen. You can't see it because you can't separate the mental game from the golf swing, for better or for worse. They are separate, but they are very much interrelated. So I just want to give you that analogy of, let's say, the person going through an injury transition and getting close to getting back on the field. And let's say a golfer also getting close to the finish line. It can really make that last piece quite difficult.
That analogy it was mind blowing. I've been a physical therapist for 20 years. Yeah. I knew that with golf, but I never thought about that with my athletes returning to sport, that they would tighten up as they get closer. Hey man, I really, really, really appreciate having you on, Seth Kaplan. We'll have in the bio, we'll have links to if people want to work with you. We'll make sure we share this out. Man, I look forward to having you back on again as a guest as we come up with some other stuff, maybe on some panels and stuff like that.
Oh yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I look forward to working with you so much. Thanks for coming on my show. Have a great day, man.
Andrew, I really appreciate the opportunity. This is just fun. I like talking about sort of sports psychology and performance. And I know you do such a great work with your athletes. So yeah, let's might be an opportunity to collaborate, and I thought this was a really great experience. So I hope we can do it again.
All right. Thanks, bud. Have a good day.
Thanks, Andrew. Have a good day.